Good morning, everybody. This is Thor Pritchard. I'm working with Adobe Education here, and we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to let you know this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to YouTube on the Adobe Education channel in the coming week or so. And to get us started, why don't we go ahead and introduce Remy Mansfield, who's from Adobe, to talk about this series of webinars.
Hey, thank you, Thor. Welcome, everyone. Thor, can you hear me okay? Is audio good?
Yep, you're good.
Great. Well, hello and welcome, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Remy Mansfield, and I'm Education Programs Manager at Adobe Education. I'm looking forward to today's webinar. Let me first, however, set the stage. This is an exciting time for higher education institutions. New technologies and models are driving change in public and institutional policies and the teaching and learning practices in the classroom. More people are gaining access to some form of higher education than at any other time in history. There are renewed, active, and open debates around higher education's role in society and our personal lives. Adobe Education is adding its voice to the conversation. Today we kick off a 7-part aspirational webinar series on the future of higher education and the transformation of the educational experiences that are preparing students for what we are calling the creative economy. This series features a collection of thought leaders who represent a diverse set of perspectives from the field of higher education. The goal of the series is to advance ongoing dialogues around key topics such as preparing students for the future, digital pedagogy, and the college of tomorrow. Jeff Selingo, author of the new book, There is Life After College, will kick off the series today with the live discussion, The College of Tomorrow and the Future of Higher Education. Jeff will take us on a tour of the College of Tomorrow. He'll present his vision for what a redesigned bachelor's degree might look like, how education will move to a lifelong and just-in-time model, and how traditional education can prove its value in a crowded marketplace of choices. Jeff is also the author of College Unbound, The Future of Higher Education and What It Means for Students, a New York Times best-selling education book in 2013, and MOOC U, Who is Getting the Most Out of Online Education and Why. He is a regular contributor to the Washington Post and is special advisor and professor of practice at Arizona State University. Jeff is also a visiting scholar at Georgia Tech's Center for 21st Century Universities. He is the former top editor of the Chronicle of Higher Education, where he worked for 16 years in a variety of reporting and editing roles. Jeff, welcome and thank you for talking with us.
Thanks, Remy. It's great to be here. Can you hear me okay?
Sound great. Audio is perfect. Well, let me, without any further ado, let me hand over the reins for you to share with us today.
Okay, thank you. And it's great to be here, and thanks for all the folks joining us around the country and around the world. I've just been looking at all the participants joining and where they're from. I'm going to present for a bit here, and then we're going to leave plenty of time at the end for questions. So please ask your questions during the webinar, and then we'll get to them at the end. So as Remy mentioned, I wrote a book a couple of years ago called College Unbound, and it's a subject that I got interested in writing about after spending nearly 20 years at the Chronicle of Higher Education, including 4 years as its top editor. And I was invited at the time, this is in 2011, to a day-long session at Harvard Business School that was put on by Clay Christensen, who many of you might remember, the famed Harvard Business School professor who was writing his own book about the future of higher education, and he felt that this idea of disruptive innovation was about to hit higher education, and that legacy incumbents in the higher education field, colleges and universities, were about to undergo massive change, and some of them even would merge or go out of business. What I heard that day both frightened and fascinated me, and so particularly since the parents I was talking to who wanted their kids to go to college were thinking that the college experience for their sons and daughters would be the same as it was for them if they had gone to college 20 or 30 years ago. And so I spent the next 2 years from that moment that I was at Harvard Business School looking at the future of higher education, visiting countless colleges and universities, talking to faculty members, students, employers, and others. And I've continued that research now in the last couple of years, mainly talking to employers about what they are and are not getting from higher education, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well during my talk today, and welcome questions on all of these subjects. So I got my start covering higher education back in the 1990s when I interned at U.S. News and World Report, and I worked on their college rankings. And what you're seeing here are the first annual rankings from U.S. News and World Report back in 1989. So if you know anything about the history of the rankings in the U.S. Particularly, U.S. News and World Report started ranking universities back in the early 1980s. It was an exercise that they did every other year at the time, and then in 1989 they started to do this annually. If you look closely at this list, there's a couple of interesting things. You're probably most focused on that right-hand column, which is tuition back in 1989, and what a great deal Stanford was, under $12,000 a year. But what interests me about these rankings was, first of all, this is all U.S. News and World Report did back in the 1980s. They only ranked the top 25 national universities. They didn't do regional lists. They didn't do online universities. They didn't do global universities, all of which they're doing now, of course. But the other thing was that they only based these rankings on a survey that they took of college presidents and college and university admissions officers. And they basically asked those folks to rank the colleges based on their reputation, which is the number there you see in that middle column under rating. That was the last year they did that. And starting the following year, and I got to U.S. News and World Report in 1994, they started to look at an array of information sources around colleges and universities, what I call the input measures for colleges and universities. So, you know, how many students they accepted and rejected, the academic profile of those students, how much they spent on faculty and fundraising. And what ended up happening as a result is that the next 20 years in higher education, largely started by the U.S. News and World Report rankings, but then followed by every rankings scheme imaginable that came around following the U.S. News and World Report, is that everybody wanted to move one or two steps up the ladder because it was all about gaining prestige in higher education, mostly focused on these input measures for higher education. And so it's not that higher education institutions are not innovative. In fact, many of them are very innovative. But most of that innovation, as I see it, is happening in corners of campus, in individual schools, in individual departments. And even though it might be working, there's a reluctance to bring it to kind of the core of the university, largely because too many universities are still driven by this prestige race in higher education. And what I want to outline today is not only a new pathway for higher education, but I feel that over the next 10 or 15 years, that we are going to move away from this prestige race that's largely based on these input measures I was describing earlier. And we now, because of the presence of data we know on outcomes, we are going to move to a system that is much more focused on the outcomes of higher education, which I think will strengthen the higher education system in many ways and strengthen institutions that I think are really good on their outcomes, even if their inputs are not as good as people think they are. And why is this? Why are we about to see this change? Well, for one thing, for all the talk, particularly around this time of year, about how difficult it is to get into college, the reality is, according to this research done by Caroline Hawksby, who's an economist at Stanford University, 50% of colleges have actually become less selective over the last 50 years as admissions has become less of a regional and even local business, and now much more, especially for the institutions at the top, much more of a national and international recruitment market. What ends up happening, because some colleges are having trouble filling their seats, and we know this from surveys that show that last year half of American colleges either had to discount their tuition too much in order to fill their seats, or they had to go with smaller enrollments. As a result, you tend to see predictions like I was mentioning earlier from Clay Christensen, who said the bottom 25% of every tier of college or university will disappear or merge in the next 10 or 15 years. Now, I don't think this is going to happen. I think it's very difficult to put a college out of business. They're heavily regulated and heavily subsidized around the world. And we also saw just last year near my hometown in Washington, D.C., Sweetbriar College, which was a small little women's college of 700 students, tried to go out of business or announced they were going to go out of business, and then there was an uproar, not only by alumni, but politicians in the state, and they stopped it. So here we couldn't even. Here was a failing college of 700 students that was about to go out of business, and it couldn't even go out of business. So I think that this idea that 25% is going to go out of business is probably a bit of a reach. But that doesn't mean that higher education is not going to change. And if you think of all the businesses and industries that have undergone massive change over the last 10 or 15 years, largely driven by technology. Think of what it was like to be in the boardroom of Blockbuster when Netflix came along, or Borders when Amazon came along, or Tower Records when iTunes came along, and even think now about Apple, which a couple of years ago had to go out and acquire for several $1 billion Beats Music because people weren't downloading music anymore, they're streaming music. So there's this evolution in the world because of technology, and I saw this in my own industry. I grew up in journalism, and in the late 1990s, I would be at conferences of journalists, of editors and reporters, and we'd have somebody at the front of the room talking about how one day people would read newspapers on a desktop computer. And everybody's head was shaking in the room, right? Never going to happen. And then we know within the next decade after that, the massive changes that happened in journalism. And today we have half as many people employed in journalism as we did in 2000, largely because of these technology changes we knew potentially would happen. And we were warned about and didn't want to do anything about as a result. And I think that in some ways higher education is now at the cusp of those changes that have happened in all these other industries. And my hope is that they will be better prepared than all these other industries were for the changes that are coming along now. So we tend to think in higher education about two groups of students, right? You either serve a traditional model or a non-traditional model in higher education, traditional being 18 to 22-year-olds, non-traditional, everybody else. And what this tends to forget about, especially in this day and age, is that there are many reasons and motivations and mindsets for why people get a degree. So it's not just this idea, well, I'm 18, I'm going to go to college, or I'm a working adult, I'm going to go to college. There's many reasons why people go to college. And so a couple of years ago, I worked with the Parthenon group out of Boston, and what we wanted to find out was what were those motivations for colleges, or for students to go to college, and what were students getting out of those experiences. So we did a survey of 3,000 students who were getting their bachelor's degree, and what we found was fascinating in terms of what they wanted. And so we ended up putting them in 6 different buckets. So we went from 2 buckets to 6 different buckets, and we found out that there's the segments of these students are very different from one another in terms of what they want out of higher ed, but yet higher ed, for the most part, was delivering this one-size-fits-all system. And so on one hand, you had these people who would fall into that traditional bucket, right? There were the young academics. These were students who, top of their class, would move right into college. And these were students that, of course, every president wanted more of because they tended to help those U.S. News and World Report rankings I was talking about earlier. Then you had the coming of age students. These are students who could move through college, and they went to college because they didn't know what else to do, and it was a maturing process for them. And then you had the career starters. These were students who went to college, who saw college as a means to an end, which was that job. And in many ways, those career starters at the age of 18 had a lot more in common in terms of their mindset to the career accelerators. These were students who might be 10, 20, 30 years older who were coming back to college because they needed to get another degree or another credential to move ahead in their careers. And then the industry switchers, a lot of those former journalists I was talking about earlier, who had to go back to college because they needed to get into a new industry, and then the needle wanderers. These were people who would tend to know they had to go back to college to get some sort of degree as a signal to the workforce that they were ready. And what was interesting is as we sized these different groups, you could see the young academics only made up about a quarter of the students that we interviewed, and there were all these other segments that, for the most part, had different needs than those young academics, but weren't being well served by the one-size-fits-all system that we have largely in higher education. So in many ways, it's a great time to be in the industry of higher education because there are more students around the world demanding a higher education, some sort of higher education than ever before. The problem is that we have too many institutions serving one or two segments of these students, and what I think we need to think about is who are these future students and how best can we serve them, because the current model is really unsustainable. We hear a lot about student debt more than $1 trillion in student debt. We hardly ever hear about this number, and this is the amount of debt that institutions have taken on, which has nearly doubled since 2001. It's all fine and good if you take on debt. We all do it in our own lives, but you think you're going to have the money to pay off that debt. And what's now happening, particularly in the U.S., is that 3 out of 4 colleges, according to Moody's, so 75% of colleges have either flat or declining net tuition revenues. That's the cash they have on hand to invest in their academic programs and in some cases pay off this debt. And so even though they keep raising their tuition over the years, their sticker price, the amount of cash that they're collecting from that tuition is actually flat and declining. And even if they're able to figure that out, this is what worries me even more. So this is the percentage of median earnings in the U.S. that go to pay for tuition. This is the sticker price of tuition. But even if you look at the net price, which is the price students actually pay after financial aid, it's just as in some ways a worrisome picture. So back in 2001, families paid less than a quarter of their family income towards college, and by today, in 2016, they pay almost over 40% of that of their money into tuition. And why is that? Partially, it's because of those numbers at the bottom that you're seeing at your screen, which is essentially that median earnings in the U.S. have been flat and declining over time. And so this is a macroeconomic problem for colleges and universities. And if you look at the future student body coming to college, they actually come from some of the poorest families in the U.S. So this is a problem that's actually just going to get worse over the next 10 years in higher education. So when we think of how we define higher education in the U.S., it's largely shaped, and I was really surprised when I was reporting my books of how much it's shaped by popular culture. Right? So you think about Monsters University, which is down there in the left-hand in corner. When the writers of Monsters University had to figure out what a college or university in 2016 looks like, they ended up going to Berkeley, Harvard, and MIT, because to them, that's what a college is. And to most Americans, that's how they think of college. But back to the matter is that, in my mind, that's the Hollywood version of college. 80% of students, 80% of students don't have that experience that we tend to think of as typical college. So only 20% of students go full-time to a residential campus and graduate in 4 years after coming out of high school. So 80% are having that different experience, and for the most part, colleges and universities are not serving them in the right way. And even for those students who get into college and start off, a third now transfer at least once before they earn a bachelor's degree. 4 out of 5 are drifting through college without a good sense of what they want to do, mainly because, especially in the U.S., when you graduate from high school, you have very few options about what to do next. You go to the military, you could go to get a job, and not a very good one. You could live in your parents' basement, and most parents don't want to do that, or you go to college, which is why many people go to college, and then unfortunately many of them end up in this group. 400,000 students who drop out of college every year. And in fact, we have more people now in their 20s than in any other age group in the U.S. Who have college credit and no degree, which is a worrisome trend for the future of the country. But even for those students who get off to the other side and graduate, many of them are finding some difficulty in the job market. And in my new book, There Is Life After College, I really look at this tenuous transition that many students have between college and the workforce. And in fact, 50% of students today, nearly 50% of students, according to the Federal Reserve, are underemployed, meaning they're in jobs that don't require a bachelor's degree. And as I talk to employers, I wanted to find out, why is there such a disconnect between our higher education system and the workforce? And over again, I heard from employers and surveys that are taken by a number of different organizations about the skill sets that today's students need to know and need to have. And when you think about it, these are all the skill sets of the broad liberal arts, working in teams and communication and problem solving. And 30 or 40 years ago, when fewer people needed a bachelor's degree to succeed what would end up happening is that they would go to college, they would get that broad liberal arts education, and then they would come out and they would either go to graduate school or professional school and get trained in a specific discipline, or they would go off to a job that would train them in a specific field, mainly because they would be staying in that occupation for the rest of their lives, and in some cases they might even be staying in that particular with that particular company. The problem now is that we expect both of those things to happen at the same time, and they happen in tandem, which is why on many campuses you see a lot of tension between the liberal arts on one side and the practical arts on the other side. But at the same time, we're overworking the bachelor's degree. We have way too many expectations for what we expect out of the bachelor's degree in the U.S. So we expect it to have that broad liberal arts, the practical arts training at the same time. We also expect students to get a lot of off-campus experiences, experiential learning, undergraduate research, study abroad, and project-based learning, which is all good and necessary for the workplace. And then we have many more students now coming to campus not prepared to do college-level work, so many of them have to take, as a result, they have to take remedial courses, and we expect all of this to happen in 4 years, which is why we have so many students having so much difficulty trying to keep, trying to get out of college and get out of college with a degree that will be valuable in the workplace. And largely it's because we need to rethink our model around education and the workforce. So if you think about it, this is the traditional model. My dad, who recently turned 80, this is a model that he followed. He was a school teacher, so he went to college, eventually got his master's degree, got a teaching job, did that for 32 years, and then retired. So very linear, very simple degree pathway. This is the model we have now, though. It's this new model of education where the transition from education to the workforce is much longer, much slower. It requires students to move and hop between jobs and even occupations much more than in the past. And it even requires them to get additional education, to invest more in their human capital in their 20s. And so what ends up happening then is that by the time they reach 30, that's the time now that they are getting started in their career and learning more in their career. So if you look at Bureau of Labor Statistics, this is work that Georgetown Center on Education and the Workforce has done, the average age of financial independence for today's college graduates is 30. Back in 1982 it was 26. So just since 1982 it's moved 4 years. That's the age when they reach the median wage. And what we're seeing is that it's taking a lot longer for 20-somethings to launch. Now, some people think this is a terrible trend, but I think that what this requires us is to rethink the model of higher education to capture those students in their 20s who need to have this period of learning and earning to succeed. So a third of students today, a third of people born today might live to see their 100th birthday. But yet we think of college as this one place you go to one time in your life, usually at the age of 18, and you end up at 22, and you're retiring. And they're also switching jobs a lot more often, right? But what's the second question somebody asks a student at the age of 18 when they find out they're going to college? The first question is, what are you going to major in? Second question is, or the first question is where you're going. The second question is, what are you going to major in? Which is why students have this idea that a major equals a career. And then they get to the other side 4 years later, they start applying for jobs, and the jobs are almost like a foreign language to them. They don't understand all the different jobs that are out there because everybody kept focusing them on a major 4 years later. And this is really at the center of the thesis for my book, is that all of these changes, demographic, financial, technological, that are bearing down right now on higher education means we're going to have a shift in the coming years where the student, it's much more about the student, their pathways through higher education and the workforce. And the institutions, I think, that are going to survive and thrive in the future are those that focus on the needs of the students and what they have to have in order to succeed. And so what does this look like? Well, first of all, I feel like we are moving away from this box of higher education where a student enters at the age of 18. They spend 4 years there, and they exit at the age of 22. That will continue to be the experience for students who go to elite, selective universities and for a very small slice of the population. But for all of, even for them, I think higher education and education in general is going to become much more of a lifelong pursuit, where we move from this box to a platform of lifelong learning, mainly because of the demands of the economy. And so what might this look like? So for one, there's not one pathway. I think that we are going to need to move away from this idea that there's this one-size-fits-all experience, and it's either a 2-year degree or a 4-year degree, and it's mostly either had on a physical 4-year campus or a physical 2-year campus, or it's had online. I think you're going to see a mixture of experiences for students, online and hybrid, meaning a mix of the two, where you're going to have apprenticeships and internships built much more into the curriculum, potentially some low residency options, which means you're going to spend only a couple weeks on campus and spend much more time off campus in the workforce. So I think the future is not just one pathway that we largely have now, but multiple pathways through higher education. What might that look like? Well, first of all, we already have students doing it. I profile many of them in College Unbound, including people like Jose James, who is part of this growing group of students who are swirling through higher education. So this is a concept that's been around since the 1970s, but the idea was always, well, students who swirl, who move around institutions, they either can't get it together financially or they can't get it together academically. And what we're finding now is nearly a quarter of students who come from families making over $100,000 a year, who tend to probably come from families who are not first generation, but second or third generation college going, are now starting to see, you know what, moving among multiple institutions is not a bad idea. For one thing, starting at a community college is less expensive in many cases, and you get a chance to explore, especially if you don't know what you want to do. So I think we're going to see a future where many more students are moving through multiple providers of education, whether they're traditional colleges or universities or others. At the same time, I think we're going to see students mixing and matching course types. So Jennifer Black, who I met at the University of Central Florida, took a quarter of her classes in either online or hybrid format. That enabled her, as a full-time student, to take on an internship, to have a minor. And we talked earlier about this idea of the overworked bachelor's degree, right? We're trying to do too much in the course of 4 years. And I think what this enables us to do is that students sometimes are able to move seamlessly between a face-to-face course, a hybrid course, and an online course. By having more flexibility, we give students the opportunity to potentially complete college in 4 years while having all those experiential learning opportunities. And then finally, there's this idea of the competency-based degree, which is gaining in popularity. Over 300 colleges now offer some sort of competency-based degree. This is Cheryl Shoe, who I met near my hometown in Washington, D.C., who completed her degree in 2.5 years for $18,000 at Western Governors University, which is one of the pioneers of this idea of competency-based education. And then at the same time, you see an increase in these number of just-in-time providers, which is really a trend that I talk about now in the second book, in There Is Life After College, because this was a trend that was just starting to take off when College Unbound came out a couple of years ago. And this is this idea that we think, for the most part, that education has to be had at a formal environment, in a form or by a formal institution, and particularly at the graduate school level. Many people ask me, is the bachelor's degree dead? I don't think that the bachelor's degree is dead, but I have a lot more worry about the master's degree. And in fact, in many cases, we see now graduate school enrollments flattening, especially for domestic U.S. students. The only reason they're growing in some areas is because of international students. And more students in their 20s are taking advantage of these new educational providers. They're navigating this new education economy that includes places like Coursera and edX, which are the massively online open courses, or lynda.com, which is now owned by LinkedIn. And we even see now places like General Assembly. Excuse me, 1 minute. We see places like General Assembly, which offers courses as short as a couple of weeks to courses as long as 11 weeks. And they offer these courses anywhere from a couple dollars to $11,000 for courses in computer coding. But what fascinated me about the times that I have visited General Assembly is that their average age of their student is 25, and almost all of them have bachelor's degrees already. So these are students who already have a bachelor's degree, and they're coming back for that practical experience that helped them in the workforce. And I think we're really moving to a time when more and more graduates in their 20s and their 30s and 40s will be doing this and getting these badges. And in fact, we already have a traditional university thinking about how can we incorporate this into the undergraduate experience. So this is a design that Stanford came up with 2 years ago from their world-renowned design school, this idea of Stanford 2025. They came out with 4 ideas. This is just one of them. You could Google the rest to find their other ideas. But the idea was an open-loop university. So instead of getting access to just 4 years of education when you got accepted to Stanford, you would get access to 6 years, and you would loop in and out over those 6 years. So we already have institutions thinking about this idea of lifelong education. So if you think about those companies that I described earlier, the Blockbusters of the world, the Tower Records of the world, what ended up happening in all of those industries is that the distance between the producer and the consumer started to shrink. And in many cases, the middleman, in those cases, the retail stores, went out of business. And so what happens if that happens in higher education? What are the risks and opportunities for traditional colleges and universities today if that distance between the producer and the consumer, in this case the teacher and the student, starts to reduce? Well, we already know, for example, that many more people are taking courses online. This is MR University, which stands for Marginal Revolution University. It's a university I signed up for a couple of years ago. It's run by Tyler Cowen, who is a behavioral economist at George Mason University. They weren't jumping on the MOOC bandwagon a couple of years ago. So one night he went home, he recorded his lectures on a $5 iPad app and put up MR University the next day. It's great for somebody like me who needs to brush up on economics. And he has actually reached more students in the course of a year operating MR University than he has done in more than 10 years of teaching at George Mason University. So I think we're going to see an explosion of these new ways of learning over the coming years. And I think this will be the basis for this lifelong education that I talked about in the beginning of the presentation. So for colleges and universities, I think the key question is, what are they doing that's a commodity that anybody can do, the English 101, the Econ 101 courses, and what are they doing that's truly innovative and different? And this is really a hard question. It seems like a very simple question, but it's a very hard question for most colleges and universities to answer because they're in the knowledge business, right? They're in the knowledge creation business, the research business, and for the most part, it's all about growing what they want to do and not necessarily shrinking what they want to do. And if you ask anybody on campus this question, you're probably going to get a different answer for every person. But I think that colleges really need to figure out what adds value to what they're doing. So this is a survey question that's been asked on numerous surveys over the years, from Gallup and Time Magazine to the Carnegie Foundation to the Chronicle of Higher Education, and it asks the question about value, and it asks parents and students and others about their perceptions of values for the money spent. And as you can see here, the public and faculty are fairly low on what they rate as good or excellent, while the presidents of the universities rate the value for the money spent at their own institutions as very high. And so what I think is happening is that we have this gap between the value and the perceived value by the public and even faculty members because they think that the courses that they're teaching are not as rigorous as they used to be, and the presidents who run these institutions. And I think until they get closer, we're going to have a really hard time tackling the big challenges facing higher education. And I think value in the coming years is going to get much more, it's going to get much easier to measure the value of higher education because we're going to be focused much more on outputs in higher education. So these are pages that you probably have seen on LinkedIn. So LinkedIn knows when people switch jobs probably before their own alma mater knows. And so these were pages that LinkedIn started aggregating all the data on their 300 million members around the world a couple of years ago because they know where those students went to school. And in the last couple of years, they've released all these new education products, new rankings that are based on outputs. So now they can reverse engineer the career of somebody who is an executive at a company, and they know all the experiences that they had, not only the jobs they had, but also important, where they went to school, what did they major in, what are the courses they had and the experiences that they had, so that it helps students who are coming up figure out the pathways they should take to get these jobs or potentially get these jobs. And in some ways, this goes back to where I started today. Because I think, and it's not only LinkedIn, but it's The Economist, it's the U.S. government, we're now starting to look at the outcomes of higher education, where U.S. News and World Report has long ranked colleges based on the inputs. We're now increasingly starting to see this idea of ranking colleges based on outputs. And in many ways, I think this could democratize. I think this could democratize the future of higher education and really raise the profile of institutions that are doing a great job at helping students prepare for life after college, and not just picking the best students coming in the door like most selective colleges do. So I want to end by talking about the future of higher education in the context of the history of the U.S. and of the world, because as I was reading up on change in higher education, almost every single decade since the rise of mass higher education in the 1940s, we've had predictions like Craig Christensen, who says, dozens of colleges and universities are going to go out of business. And in fact, in this Newsweek article from April 1976, that was the exact prediction, that that dozens of colleges and universities would go out of business in the 1980s. We actually have more colleges and universities now than we had then. Newsweek is out of business, but most colleges and universities are still in business. So the thing about change is that we tend to overestimate the speed of it, but we tend to underestimate the depth of it. And so I think that as we think about the next 10, 20, 30 years in higher education, I think that we need to think about not only the changes that are on the horizon, but we need to think what is potentially possible. Because if you remember, when I used to be at conferences as a reporter back in the 1990s, and everybody said, well, one day somebody would read a newspaper on a desktop computer. Never did they predict that we would be reading something that's on a device as small as a cell phone. So I appreciate you being in the room today for this webinar. We have some time to take questions and answers, and I know some of them have been coming in the chat room, and I'm going to turn it back to Remy, who is going to moderate the discussion part of this.
All right, thank you, Jeff. Always good to hear you talk and spark ideas. I have a list here of questions that I've written down. I'm gonna start with some questions for you, giving folks a chance to type in the higher ed chat box any questions that they have, ideas that Jeff sparked in his presentation. Feel free to type them here. I'm going to kick it off with maybe one of the things that really struck me was you presenting I think it was Parthenon report from 2013. There were I think you said there were 6 or 7 different groups of students. 4 of them I really focused on, which one was career starters, second was career accelerators, third industry switchers, and adult wanderers. And it made me think about this other quote that you had during the presentation, which is 30 is the new 21, essentially.
Right.
That 30 is sort of where you are starting to figure things out, figure out what your career is, where you want to go, still learning and earning, but really sort of putting the pieces together. Do you have a sense of the skills these students are seeking or benefiting from? Are they digital literacy related? Are they tied to a certain vocation? Just curious if you're seeing any trends of what those particular skills are and how students are benefiting.
So what I think is happening in that period of their 20s is that students are graduating from college and they have broad-based skills, and in many cases, in some cases I should say, they have the soft skills that employers demand, the problem solving, working in teams, but they don't have those basic job skills for a specific industry that they used to be able to get on the job, that employers are not necessarily providing, or that they could have gotten in college if they had known exactly what they wanted to do. And so what ends up happening is I meet many recent graduates, and I hear this also from colleges themselves, is that students are really well prepared 2 years out of college after they've gone through some sort of finishing experience. And most of the time that finishing experience or finishing school used to happen on the job, and it's not anymore, right? So what I think the rise of these alternative education platforms has done is fill in that gap, right? It has become, they have become these finishing schools for students. So giving them very specific skills, hands-on skills or other academic skills. And so they're going to, Coursera and edX for courses, or they're going to General Assembly or lynda.com for specific courses, face-to-face and online, or other avenues like, bridge programs that give them those transitional skills from the job. So it's really about this transitional period, which could last anywhere from a year to 2 years after college. It's short of graduate school because it's not as broad as graduate school, but it's and this is why they're called boot camps, because if you think about the concept of the military boot camp, is it doesn't give you every skill you need in life. It gives you the basics to get started, and that's what they're doing. They're giving you the basics to get started.
That feeds really nicely into another question I was thinking about, which you talk about finishing experience or just-in-time education providers. I was curious, what role do you see they play in accreditation, credentials, credit? If students are going through, let's say, the 4 years, or it takes them 6 to 8 years to get through the more traditional brick-and-mortar college experience, they come out, they go to these boot camps or just-in-time places. Will the market of students tell us what to keep in terms of what value those boot camps or those programs provide us, or do you think it'll be the same accreditor who are giving stamps of approval to say, a course from General Assembly is better than a course from Coursera or edX? How do you see that playing out?
I think it's going to be the market. I think it's going to be the outcomes of those courses and those providers that is going to provide the signal to students about which ones are high quality and which ones are not. So I think I think this learning economy that is emerging is going to operate on a much different level than traditional colleges and universities. I don't think the accreditation system will work there. I agree that students need some sort of signal of quality, but given that that these boot camps have one role only, and that is really to get you a job, the best signal of their success or of their quality is, well, how well do they succeed in terms of placements? Which is why you see all of these providers, especially ones that charge money and some that charge a lot more money, all focused on those outcomes, right? Because that's the one outcome. Where colleges and universities have multiple jobs, right? They're supposed to broadly educate somebody. They're supposed to mature them and make them into good citizens. They're supposed to help you get a job, right? They have multiple jobs. So if you just focus just on the job outcome of higher education, I think you're missing out on the other pieces of it, which is the role that accreditors and the federal government are supposed to play. So I see them operating on two different planes.
I see. And you bring up a term, learning economy. I know a lot of us here at Adobe and on the Adobe Education Exchange, we talk about the creative economy. And I was curious if there are particular schools or characteristics of university programs that you see that model what are best practices for preparing students for either the learning economy or the creative economy.
Well, I think that, I talked about the overworked bachelor's degree, this idea that, on campuses we have the practical arts and the liberal arts coexisting. And I think at those institutions where they coexist and they peacefully coexist, so that students are getting the best hands-on experience and the best broad learning, and it's happening connected to each other, and so they're able to transfer their learning between the two. Those are the institutions that I think are really kind of getting it right now. And among those are places like Northeastern University, which and Georgia Tech and others that offer apprenticeships and co-ops as part of the experience, where again it's not an add-on experience, not a bolted-on internship that you take during the summer, but it's literally integrated into the undergraduate experience. Those are the ones that I think are getting it right. They're not on because I think that this is kind of a false argument right now about the role of college.
Interesting. Do you see industry playing a particular role, or do you see them playing a wide variety of collaborative partnerships with universities? How do you see industry and university working together?
Well, I see that higher ed has had not a great history with industry, and it's skeptical. Many people are skeptical of colleges, or skeptical of employers on college campuses and probably in some ways for good reason, right? For the most part, employers have outsourced all of their training and education to colleges and universities. They expect them, students to come fully formed out of colleges and universities. So I kind of understand that. At the same time, I get a little nervous about colleges that chase the latest trends from employers, because we know that the market is very dynamic right now. Entire occupations are expanding and contracting at an alarming pace, given the pace of change in the work world and the global economy. So this idea that a college should offer this major because this employer wants it makes me a little nervous. And also, employers are not a monolithic group, just like students are not a monolithic group. Colleges and universities are monolithic, right? And so you talk to any employer, and if you talk from the CEO down to the chief HR person, down to the line managers doing day-to-day hiring, they're going to differ greatly, even within an organization, about what they want. And so I think that there needs to be some connection, but I think that higher education, for all its faults, has done a pretty good job at preparing human capital for the economy for centuries, and particularly for for this new global age that we live in now. And I think that we should not throw all of that out as we think about the future.
I'll let Megan step in here with a question. I'm interested in how the faculty and college presidents rank the value of education, and wonder if you can comment on that.
Yeah, so that was really fascinating. There was that slide I showed about the differences between the public at large and faculty. And what really surprised me about that is that, well, first of all, presidents think, the value of higher education is very high. And I guess in some ways that doesn't surprise me. But it worries me because they're so far from the public, and that gap, I think, until it closes, I think that presidents in particular need to figure out how they increase their value of their institutions and of their degree. But it was the faculty that really surprised me. And when that survey was done, that was a survey that was done by the Chronicle of Higher Education. We did a bunch of follow-up interviews with faculty members, because I was very curious about why they thought what they did. And what we heard over and over again was that faculty are a little worried about the rigor of the classroom, and that this idea that it's much easier to get an A now than it used to be, and students are not taking as rigorous majors as they used to be, and really in terms of the reporting that I did for this most recent book, everybody always asks, well, how do I pick a major? I always encourage them, unless you're going to be an engineer or have to have a very specific major like that, pick the major where you're going to work the hardest, where you're going to have peers that work hard and mentors, and that where you're going to do a ton of writing, a ton of reading, and other homework, because that's really what's going to prepare you best for the workforce. And I think that's what faculty were reacting to. They just don't feel like there's that rigor that we used to have, which is why so many students are, having trouble in the workforce afterwards.
Do you think higher education should partner more with K12?
Definitely. We have a bifurcated system right now. We have students who graduate from high school, and as I mentioned, they have no idea what else to do, and so they end up going to college as a result. Many of them drop out because they're ill-prepared. I think there's, especially between the senior year of high school and the freshman year of college, I think there could be much more blending between the two. I think there could be much more career exploration, because many students go to college having no idea what they want to do, and it's very expensive to do that exploration in college. So if there's any, I think there could be a deeper partnership throughout K through 12, but particularly at the high school level. And we already see this with dual enrollment courses and AP courses, but I think it could even be deeper than that, where there could be much more of a blending, particularly between the senior year and the freshman year of college.
One piece that I want to touch on is around, again, the just-in-time education providers. You mentioned MOOCs, you mentioned online education. Is that a big trend in universities right now? Is that really something that you see that's going to stick around? Do you see it evolving into a different form? How how should, if I'm a university, how should I be looking at this space and thinking about my own digital transformation, both in my faculty's classrooms, but also me as an institution and the programs that I provide to students?
Well, if you're running an institution or at an institution, you don't have a digital strategy, I think you're in trouble. I don't think MOOCs, MOOCs got a lot of attention a couple of years ago. I wrote a book called MOOC U a couple of years ago where I followed one course and the students in it. I don't think that's going to really disrupt traditional undergraduate education. I think it's a good supplement to that. I think that most of the students taking it are doing it for more professional reasons or curious. They're adults who already have degrees. I do think that what MOOCs have done in a good way is really spark conversations on campuses around teaching and learning. So I see many more faculty now much more interested at improving their teaching and their teaching skills, sometimes under threat from MOOCs, but in other cases inspired by them. But there's a large array of online education options, and I think that colleges and universities need to have it as part of their tool set. And if they don't, and all they think of is, well, the future is residential face-to-face, most 18-year-olds don't want to go to school online, but that doesn't mean they don't want any technology infused into their undergraduate education. So again, it's a mixture of both.
Fabian Soa asks, do you think we will see an increase in colleges providing the course content for faculty? And she cites the SNHU model.
Is
that the Southern
University?
I think it's,
yeah. I mean, I think that we're going to see this case where we're going to see much more blended classrooms, where the university is essentially outsourcing the general education, the 101 courses that are very similar across the country, that are taught with a similar syllabus and similar books, often taught by adjuncts at large universities anyway, or grad students. I can see that being outsourced centrally to good providers, and then you would have faculty who would join in on the discussions and the seminar parts of that. I also think it allows universities to focus much more on upper level, upper level courses in that case. So yes, I see much more of an unbundled product in higher education, where universities are much more part of this learning network that I described later, and not trying to do everything by themselves.
And if Fabian has a follow-up, how do you feel about that?
I don't know. I like most people, I have, higher education serves, especially in the U.S., it's one of the best exports that the U.S. has. It's been around for centuries, and I get a little nervous about just jumping on the latest trend. I also get nervous. I have a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old at home. They get one shot at everything, right? They only have first grade once. They only are seniors in high school once. I don't want them experimented on too much, because if the experiment goes wrong, it could ruin them for the rest of their lives, right? So, so I'm a big fan of evolution, not revolution, in higher ed, and I feel like higher ed is evolving and evolving quickly. I'm a big fan of small experiments, and let's see if they work, and then scale them up across universities. And I mentioned that earlier in the presentation. There's a lot of good ideas happening on college campuses. We need the ones that are working. We need to really bring them more to the central part of the institution and scale them up. So as long as we're not moving too quickly, just fast enough, I think is good.
That idea you're talking about, identifying what's working well and thinking about bringing them to the center of the institution and scaling them up. Jeff comments that he spent a day at CSAIL at MIT last week, I think the Center for Artificial Intelligence at MIT, and last weekend it was pretty amazing. How do we expand access to spaces like that in which students can really learn to play and love learning?
Yeah, I know. It's really a shame. I spend a lot of time in the new book on makerspaces that have popped up on campuses, and I visited them at Lehigh and the University of Southern California, and in every single case, it was like a dozen students who got this experience, or a couple dozen students, not thousands of students. And to me, the best learning is that one that you navigate on partially on your own. So I think that we could, not every space has to be a maker space. It doesn't always have to be hands-on, but I think that we should allow a lot more ambiguity into the undergraduate experience and allow students to, I feel like we've moved the pendulum too far one side, where in our effort to try to get more students to stay in school and graduate, which is an admirable goal, we have taken out the ambiguity out of school. And I think that we need to figure out a way to get that back in there.
Great. Well, I think with that said, we're at the top of the hour. I'm going to be conscious of time. Looks like we have a couple more last questions here. Jeff, do you have time to take maybe one more last question?
I'm actually running out of time. I can take one more quick question, and that's it.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. Well, Fabian says, you know, so who is controlling the content of a course that's offered in a class environment? Course outcomes are accredited, but academic freedom leaves course content to faculty. Are course content controlled by colleges looking for accreditation? And I think this is getting back to this idea of colleges.
I think accreditation's under massive changes right now, and I think the future is that, you know, we need some sort of quality control. I think that quality control should be much more based on outputs, and we're getting there now. And so, you know, accreditation, we need some sort of quality control on higher education. Who plays that role, I think, is going to be a big debate in the next couple of years.
Well, I think that's a great theme to leave it on, which is outputs in education. Again, this is a first part of a 7-part webinar series on the future of higher education and trends in digital transformation at universities. And what we will be looking at in future webinars are just that, examples and outputs of things like makerspaces and new bachelor's of science and bachelor's of arts degrees at leading universities from faculty who are really integrating creativity into their curriculum. Jeff, it's always good to talk with you. Thank you so much for your time and energy today and your presentation. I look forward to talking with you soon, and thank you to all of you who attended today.
Thank you, everybody. It was great to be here.